morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students. It's great to see all of you here. This big number of friends. It's honor for me that here at the field of university cinema, it's no rented by faculty of sport studies. We can welcome our dear guest, Mr. John Choice, who is the man who established Unwellness in America, who opened the first wellness center in California, and who is, I can say, father of the structural wellness and all this aspect. And I don't want to steal time from his presentation, so please welcome Mr. John Travis. The place is yours.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether to stand up here and pretend to be a authority figure. I'll try it. So this is my first time presenting this in the Czech Republic, and my Czech is nil, so it will be in English. Is this loud enough? Can you hear me okay? I can't tell. Is there any feedback? Okay. My goal today is, as I understand it, wellness has a very different meaning in Europe than it did when it first came into use in the United States back in the 70s. And it also has developed a different meaning in the United States, both of which are far from the original intention of the man who coined the term high-level wellness. And I'm going to be giving you a lot of information about him, some background. But first of all, why am I doing this? I'm going to take you back to 1970. I'm a 24-year-old, what was I, 27-year-old intern at a hospital in San Francisco. I've been 4 years in medical school in Boston. I'm a wet behind the ears doctor. And I found I couldn't prescribe drugs. I couldn't remember the doses. I couldn't remember the names. I just hated it. And my dad was a doctor. I grew up in a small town in Ohio near the, in a farmland. And I decided by age 5 to be a doctor because I wanted to get all the love and attention that my dad's patients gave him. So I blindly went through chemistry major, which I hated in college, and a medical training, which didn't much interest me in Boston. It was very different than what I'd seen my father, he was a general practitioner, a surgeon, obstetrician, ophthalmologist, gynecologist, pediatrician. He did everything, plastic surgery, even had his own pharmacy. So this wasn't what I learned at Tufts University in Boston. So here I am, an intern, full-fledged doctor, have a medical license, and I hate it. This is not right. Giving drugs just didn't do it for me. So I took a residency in general preventive medicine at Johns Hopkins, which was basically to buy time and also to avoid Vietnam, which was the other alternative at that point. And I was in the public health service, which is a uniform service. And during, and I will pick up on that story now as we go into some pictures. So I like to use the term full spectrum wellness, similar to Halbert Dunn's high-level wellness, which the term has been largely lost. First of all, why is it important? Feel free to laugh. They're meant to be funny. So I heard this from someone, I wish I remembered who it was, but it's true. There's a great degree of loneliness, both in America and Australia, where I live half the year. So it's important to recognize, though, that this is not an individual problem, it's a cultural problem. And I'm going to leave the slides that have a lot of writing or words on them. I think it'd probably be easier for you to read it than for me to read it to you. So I'll leave it up a little longer so you can read it. I know I can read German better than I can hear it. So it's important to recognize the larger picture. we call it a health care system, but it's really a sick care system. That's why I put it in quotes. Now, if you lump together all the areas that are considered wellness, and spas are a fairly new one in the States, it's $3 trillion a year. So it's a real growth industry. Now going back about 2,500 years, Hippocrates knew something. And the World Health Organization in 1948 expanded the definitions, but not much was done with it. And this man, who I met about 10 years ago, summarized what it was that I was trained to do that I didn't like. So this quote is from Dr. Dunn, the man who influenced me the most, Albert Dunn, and I'll give you more information on him in a minute. But to be clear, in the US anyway, wellness has very little to do with spas, and I understand it's mostly what people think of here. It also doesn't have to do with alternative medical treatments, even though many people in the US confuse it with that. Probably the best term I've learned from Jana is this Greek term, which is a much more expanded view. And my mission has been to take this man's ideas, which I learned about in 1971, to bring them into the culture. Here he is in 1926. He founded the U.S. Department of Vital Statistics, and he ran it for 25 years. And in his retirement, he began to publish articles. 1957, it's the first use of the word wellness in the medical literature, as far as we know. Published again in the very prestigious American Journal of Public Health, 59. And here I am at Hopkins. The first year of my residency, we had to do a master's in public health, which was very boring, and classes and epidemiology and biostatistics and things that I didn't find very interesting or useful. So I'd go over to the medical bookstore, and I found fascinating books like Maslow's work on self-actualization, his concept of hierarchy of needs. There was Virginia Satir and Carl Rogers, all these interesting guys. Hans Selye was writing about stress. I was reading all this stuff, and one day, as I walked out of the bookstore, I noticed on the clearance table, little cart, this book, marked down to $2. I think it was $2.95 originally, and it changed my life. Here's Dr. Dunn 50 years later. I thought he looked like he needed an enema, but it turns out he had Bell's palsy, and he was blind in one eye. And in this book, which was a collection of 29 lectures he gave on the radio, they were then collected into a book and published 2 years later. Here are some of the sample chapters. The yellow ones were some of the most dramatic ones that I still don't see there's much focus on community wellness or social wellness these days. And just to be clear, he didn't coin the word. It's actually nearly 400 years old. You can see it was spelled wellness there originally. And it was used a number of times in the literature, 1903, 1882, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I took Dunn's ideas and I went back. I was living in Mill Valley, as a suburb of San Francisco, over the Golden Gate Bridge. And I went back to where I'd lived as an intern, and I opened this wellness center. Well, first of all, when I arrived there, I met the guy on the left, Don Ardell, who wrote several books and also published an article about me I'll show you next, and Bill Hetler, who started the National Wellness Conference. This is where I met Jana. The three of us, we sort of the three horsemen, worked synergistically at a point where we had to spell the word on the phone. People, what? Well, W-E-L-L-N-E-S-S. Like, it was a totally unknown word at that point. So Ardell published this in Prevention magazine. That was my red beard back in those days. And it had 13 million readers. And suddenly, our tiny little office, we got over 1,000 letters. We had 2 office suites in this remodeled building in downtown Mill Valley. And I had 2 part-time staff at that point. Eventually, we expanded to where we had 13. This is only picture I could find of core staff. That's me in the middle with a lifestyle evolution group where it was like a therapy group, only we weren't dealing with problems. We were dealing with how can we make our lives happier and more well. We did have one of the first hot tubs in Mill Valley. It was downstairs. It was open to everyone in the office building. And we offered personal style consultations, nutrition, fitness. We had biofeedback. We had a complex flow chart. I won't leave this up for you to, this won't be on the exam. It's how we had the flow of clients through the program. But most importantly, we did a lot of hug therapy. Also, we were on 60 Minutes in 1979, and that just as I closed the center, I could never make the center quite break even. It costs more to run it than we could take in from client fees, and we couldn't get insurance because we weren't treating, diagnosing, or prescribing. So I made up the difference by doing public speaking, but eventually I burned out and closed the center in 1979, late 79. We also did seminars for helping professionals. These people are doctors and nurses and psychologists. They're getting continuing education credit for learning how to play again, which is something that we need more of in the world. So what are some of the symptoms of unwellness? Social capital is something that I didn't know the term. It's the hours that people spend volunteering to do things in the community, to connect with each other, and television has pretty much destroyed it. I watched the little town I grew up in. When television came in, we didn't have ice cream socials on the main street anymore. We didn't have potlucks. A lot of things stopped happening when we all had television. And a special interest of mine, which if there's time I'll go into more later, of the problem of why having children in a nuclear family often leads to a destruction of the marriage and the disappearing father. We're seeing the rise of religious tyranny and fundamentalism, crime, war, and ecocide, the destruction of the environment. So on an individual level, we see addiction, depression, both physical and emotional violence, chronic illness. Most illnesses now are chronic, and they have to do with lifestyle and often disconnection. Materialism and greed, and the cause of the epidemic of disappearing dads is male postpartum abandonment syndrome. Again, I go into that more later if we get to it. And the extremism, fundamentalism, and in the States anyway, people driving these monstrous vehicles, big gas guzzlers. So, just taking the first example on that list, depression, it's probably vastly underreported that there's 19 million. I'm guessing it's twice that. It's a leading cause of disability, and it's hardly talked about. And I have trouble believing this statistic, but I like the source. More than war, cancer, and AIDS all put together. Many other related problems. So stress. We have a lot of stressors. It isn't usual on the golf course to encounter a bear, but or this when you're flying. Thanks to Photoshop, I hope. Okay, my objectives today are to define full spectrum wellness, or FSW, to explore the three key concepts of that and to distinguish between the treatment paradigm and the wellness paradigm, and to introduce 12 dimensions of wellness. And a few more objectives are demonstrate how you can measure it using the wellness inventory, and you'll have an example of that, a very short version that you can try out yourself, which Jana has created. And to look at how personal wellness program can be generated. That's the Grand Canyon. Pretty sure this is photoshopped. I hope anyway. Having children can be stressful. Now I want to caution you, wellness gurus abound. I believe we teach what we need to learn, and quite often people don't practice what they preach. It's been a lifelong struggle for me. It's no accident that I'm doing wellness. I love this quote of Louise Hay's. I learned to be critical and find the problem and fix it, and only recently learned that finding the thing to be grateful for, to appreciate, and there's a whole science now called appreciative inquiry that looks at issues this way instead of just problem solving. But medical training, that's you got to find the problem and fix it, even if they don't want it fixed. Another projection, or the issue of shadow, is very important. That often what we hate is really our own shadow, and the people that we adore and idolize as our gold shadow, our light shadow. So things that we don't recognize in ourselves, we often project onto other people. And the last thing to remember is our gifts come from our wounds. Oh, no, we got one more here. A summary of this from Alcoholics Anonymous. If you spot it, you got it. That's the issue of shadow. Oh, we got another one too. So owning your shadow projections is probably the hardest thing. It's the penultimate or the ultimate wellness challenge, is to recognize our own shadow and how we project it onto other people. But it's how we increase our connection. So a little warning here. I like to raise more questions than I answer. I hope that will be true today, and I'll hang around if you have some questions afterwards. And now for a little quiz. It's a multiple choice. There's 4 choices. Okay, how many people will go for fitness? Put up your hands. Okay, nutrition. Connection. Oh, going to be some good grades. The Euro. And we got one taker, okay. Very good. I don't often get that strong of a response. So it took me 35 years to figure out that these 6 words are a summary of all my life work, that it really is about connection and the lack of it that we're seeing in Western culture. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of connection. We're mammals. We're hardwired to connect, and yet most babies don't get that, at least in the US. We could take a lesson from other mammals. I don't think they're dead. This picture fascinated me. I think that they're South Africans in Victoria Falls, but I'm not positive. And just the male and the female response to the same environment. Some more mammalian contact here. Now, not all connection is healthy. Their independence is somewhat threatened. And we've done lots of things to try to replace the failed connection that we were designed to have as infants. The Japanese have some creative solutions for, and this one in particular comes in 3 different colors. So just remember this, if you're having kids. Okay, now we're going to get to the protein of the discussion. What is full spectrum wellness? And for me, it began seeing this quote on a poster at a friend's living room at a party. And I had been reading Dunn, I'd been reading Maslow, and it all fell together. And one night, I put together this diagram, did it on a typewriter with some press-on graphics. And then a few years later, I hired a graphic artist to embellish it. And I'll explain it more in a few minutes. It just give you the idea that it evolved over time. This is the current version of it, which I'll go through step by step in a few minutes. It's the first of the three key concepts that we're going to cover. And just to mention that there's the wellness inventory that has evolved over time. And the latest version of it, Jana just picked up from the printers yesterday. She has some copies of it if you want to see it afterwards. I published 3 versions of the Wellness Workbook, 3 editions. Actually 4. There was a self-published 3-ring binder in 1977, but it didn't get in the bookstores. And the definitions of wellness, here are several of them. You can see this is a lot different than probably what you thought wellness was when you came in, at least I hope you'll see that. It's an ongoing process. And the integration Dunn, in his high-level wellness book, was the first person to put together mind, body, and spirit. And it's related to health. That was a radical idea for me. That's what got my attention. I thought wellness was a silly word. It would never catch on, and I was reluctant to use it when I had my center, but it did catch on. It just unfortunately didn't catch on in the way that Dunn intended it. So in summary, it's about the connections between our state of well-being and our mind, body, emotions, and spirit, earliest life experiences, so it's multidimensional, and just one of these dimensions is the lifespan from a sperm through our gestation and development. My daughter designed these for me, and we couldn't figure out how to make the dead guy not look like a statue that fell over, but that's the best she could do. And then our environment, our internal environment, that diagram in the center will be explained later on. That's the third key component, but I'm putting it in this order. As we move outward, as our environment gets larger, it's still all a reflection from the cultural to the global. Okay, that takes us through the first step, first stage. Now the 3 key concepts, the illness, wellness continuum. I've already given you a sneak preview of it. Where it came from for me was one of my mentors who was a colleague of Dunn's. I never met Dunn. I lived 20 miles from him for several years, but I didn't think it was going to amount to much, and I never bothered to go meet him. And then he died on the same month that I opened my wellness center. Anyway, another colleague of his, Lewis Robbins, who developed a health risk appraisal. I'm curious, is any of you familiar with the health risk appraisal? Has that made it here? It's a big deal for corporations now in the US. They assess your risk of premature death based on high-risk behaviors. And Louis Robbins developed this in Indiana in the 60s, and I computerized it for the Public Health Service back in the 70s. But he saw a continuum of at-risk, signs, which is what the doctor can see but you're not aware of it, symptoms, which is when you're aware of a problem, then disability, and ultimately premature death. So the treatment approach, whether it's traditional medicine or whatever, can fix things and move you back to where you've eliminated the disability, the signs, and the symptoms. But it can only go so far. And it always relates to a healer or doctor or whatever in a parent-child relationship. I call this the pill fairy. Whether they're pills or acupuncture needles or herbs or incantations, whatever it is, as long as you're looking up to somebody else to fix you, then you're in this relationship. And it's important. When you're hurting and sick, you need to find someone that can help you. But it doesn't work in the wellness situation, as you'll see in a few minutes. Also, doctors are not necessarily the best example of wellness. So here we have Robin's risk continuum, and I realized they're from the Bob Dylan quote, if you're not busy being born, you're busy dying. So this is the being born section. We move from awareness to education to growth and ultimately high-level wellness. The wellness paradigm works on both sides of the continuum. It works in conjunction with treatment on the left, but treatment can only take you to the neutral point because there's no discernible illness or wellness, and you can't fix anything that's not fixable. So this is the most important of the key concepts to explain how wellness relates to treatment and illness. Here's another look at it. It's not where you are on the continuum, but which direction you're headed. The grim-looking runner who's running out of fear and not very happy, and the cheerful but handicapped woman on the left headed in the wellness direction. You can actually have a wellness death. And one of my colleagues who helped me start the center did do that by example a few years ago. It was astounding to all of us how she dealt with her death. Real inspiration. So reviewing it, here's the relationship of the person doing wellness with a coach or a support person. They're colleagues rather than expert and passive recipient. So let's go flying together. Now, jumping back a few years in time, I used this slide back in the 70s when it was projected, and we were horrified at the cost of sick care. And this was late 70s when I found this. I then found this one a few years ago. It's still 6 years out of date. It picks up about the same place, and look where the projection is. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And particularly in the US, where the drug companies are running the show and insurance is hideously expensive, that we're hoping to get a single payer system. Bernie Sanders is finally getting support in Congress that we've never seen before, and maybe the US will join other countries in having a decent sick care system. We certainly don't now. The Iceberg Model is the second key concept. The tip of the iceberg is your state of health, whether it's diseased or healthy. If it's diseased and you start chipping away at it with drugs or whatever, more of the same thing will just come up because 90% of it's below the surface. So you have to look below the surface. Look at the person's lifestyle, look at their behaviors. And that's what the health risk appraisal did that Lewis Robbins developed and how I got originally into this. But we found we could scare people with predictions of their early death based on their bad behaviors, but it didn't motivate people. So to motivate them, you have to look a layer deeper, and that's where I got interested in the wellness inventory and asking questions about underlying attitudes and beliefs. But there's a still deeper layer. We couldn't use the word spiritual when I developed this. That was the S word. Later it became acceptable. So now I'm going to take another little poll here to know, find out how many of you had this distinction of a treatment model versus a wellness model. Anyone? You'll get lots of extra points for this on the final exam. Oh, you didn't know there's a final exam? Oh, didn't tell them. And how many of you have thought of anything like the Iceberg Model, even if it had a different name, the layers underneath? Good. And does it make sense? I hope so. Get a few hands up. All right, we'll move on to the third one. The third key concept is what I call the wellness energy system, which is also portrayed as a wheel, and you'll see that in a bit. If we use water as an analogy for energy, you can see there are three components: the source, the input, the channel through which the water flows, and the output. And here is a human represented with the two primary sources of energy are the oxygen that we breathe and the food that we eat, which are combusted through the Krebs-Henselite cycle. Anyone know that one? We had to learn that in med school. Horrible bunch of biochemistry. Producing ATP from ADP, which is what the mitochondria do to keep our cells running. But there's a third form of energy that we sense through our senses, the thermal energy from infrared radiation that helps keep us warm and so forth, and all the way to love and attention, the important connections that mammals need. Now, what we do with this energy is our body transforms it into 9 different forms. And starting up there at 1 o'clock, the most important one is how we frame it, our degree of self-responsibility and self-love. And that's a big one for most of us. We also use this energy to move our bodies, to move the blood through our circulatory system. We use energy in our brains to experience feelings, emotions, not only our brains but our heart. And it turns out our gut has a lot of emotional connection too. And we're getting a lot of our what's the word? The microbiome is producing lots of serotonin and other neurochemicals, neurotransmitters. We're just beginning to understand this, the importance of our gut health. You know, you feel it in your gut. It's literally true. We also use energy in our brains. Our brains take about 1/3 of our energy just to operate for thinking. And then there are activities of playing and working, communicating, which is very important, our connection through intimacy, finding meaning, and the spiritual dimension of transcending or going beyond our ego and the everyday things that are in front of us. So transmuting the wheel into the wheel, here are the same 12, and what we do with the wellness index is measure this. But first of all, what could go wrong in this system? And if we go back to the water analogy, the input could be dried up, so there's no flow. You're not getting an important source of energy. Or there can be a blockage in the channel. It's not coming through. Or contamination. Any number of things can go wrong with the system. And I'll illustrate them here with a slightly different version of the 3 inputs. First one is there's too little in number 1 and too much in number 2. Often people will not breathe enough and eat too much to try to dampen feelings. Number 3 up there at 1 o'clock, two of the outputs are confused, like people that confuse feeling and thinking don't make that distinction. That can cause problems. Number 4 down here at 7 o'clock, there's a blockage, a constriction. You can see it backing up in the system there. And number 5 over there at 5 o'clock, the interface with the environment is overpowering, someone who's angry all the time and you can't get close to them. Or its opposite up at 11 o'clock is number 6, where the interface is too faint, a person who is, doesn't show up. So these are just a few examples of how this human energy can go awry and lead to disease. This has been my premise since 1977 when I first thought it up. And it's the basis of the Wellness Workbook down there in the corner, which there's a copy down here on the front of the podium that Jana brought in. So here we have the interconnection with the environment around us, other people's energy system, nature, other animals. We're in a complex relationship energetically with our environment. Okay, we've covered the 3 key points. How do we assess it? Well, I showed you earlier the wellness inventory I developed in 1975. There were 100 questions. It was based on why I was so frustrated with the health risk appraisal, not changing behavior. I wanted to look at underlying questions. And it evolved over time. When we published the Wellness Workbook, and first one in 81, I expanded it to 300 questions from 100. And here are some of the sample questions where you fill in what's true for you. We also have some sentence completions. You add up your scores and divide by the number to get an average. And then you transfer that number to the wheel in the back. For each of the 12 areas, there's 12 chapters in the Wellness Workbook of these 12 forms of energy that I've covered. And then you make your own wheel. Well, back in the mid-'80s, when I got my first CPM computer, a little K-Pro, I programmed it in CPM and developed a computerized version, which is now online as a interactive web program. And it'll show you your scores this way. There are 5 different levels. Step 1 is to assess your level by answering the questions, and then look at your profile, develop a wellness plan, ideally, and then monitor your progress and get support in acting on it. So this is the online version. There are 120 questions, but they're actually statements. The question is, how true is it? And after you answer how true it is, we ask, how motivated are you to change your answer if you didn't like, if it was low? This allows you to figure out what you really care about. If you had a low score but you don't care, skip it. So this will be summarized at the end. Each statement has a link to a text from the Wellness Workbook so you can understand why it's there. It's really more of a teaching tool than an assessment tool. The gimmick of filling out a questionnaire is to get you to look at the issues. So here would be your score, graphically as well as a ranking on the right. And here's your level of motivation for each of the areas. So you can see this person has a lot more motivation to deal with feeling and playing and working than they do with transcending or sensing. So then you develop an action plan. I'll back up and give you a little more time on that one. There's a a built-in wizard that helps you, a virtual coach that helps you work out some specific, up to 5 actions, daily actions that you would do, but no more than, some people will pick way too many things, get overwhelmed, and crash and burn. So we limit it to 5 or fewer. And then you monitor your progress. And there's a number of tools for this. They're coming up here. You can journal in each of the 12 sections. You can get other resources. Here's the workbook again. There are both local resources and international ones. And after a period of time, you can retake the test and see how you're doing improvement-wise. Looks like the 4th line down there, 24% improvement. Oh, 31% for moving, so they must have gotten an exercise program going. And as I said, Jana has done the latest version of it. I don't really know what it says, but you probably do. Here are the first 2 sections of questions. It's much more colorful than my version. I did mine on a Macintosh Plus, 1980s, in black and white. So, just to remind you that the currency of wellness is connection. And I didn't mention this earlier, but if you'd like to read this book, there's a free PDF version you can download at this URL down here at the bottom. It's tinyurl.com, and then HLW is High Level Wellness 123. Somebody had already taken HLW, so I had to put the 123 in to get that URL. But I highly recommend this book. I've reread it several times, and it's amazing what he did in the 50s and how far we still have to go. So that concludes the main presentation. And how are we doing on time? Okay. Jana, do you want to pass out the, where are you? Do you have enough copies? Great. Yes, please. You want to use this one?
Yeah, so as Jack Travis said, one of the first steps towards wellness is the assessment of your own wellness. So we prepared for you little glimpse of what is in the wellness inventory. It's a set of 12 questions. Each is from 12 dimensions. So the first task is to get a pen or a pencil and to answer questions. And we'll give you a little time to get yourself organized.
Should have gotten some music to play. I didn't think of that. You could sing.
How are you doing with your wellness right now at the very moment? And you give yourself a score from 0 to 4. And the statement or the question is 0 means no, never, ever. It is true in my life now. And 4 means yes, I agree, this is the way I live by now. So answer your questions.
You didn't think there'd be a final exam. After this, let's field questions and see.
Yeah, we can sit and take, we can develop the plans, the wellness plans.
Your reserved people didn't show up.
Well, they are sitting in the back seats.
Oh. So how many of these are your students?
I recognize some students from the past semesters when we had a run together. And I believe in the center there is like a bunch of boys, so they are coming for the class of this semester.
Mm-hmm.
So I think 10% maybe. But most of the people I don't know. It could be nice fitting into the part of your presentation when you showed how to draw it. So if you like it, this very short version, you can use it in your presentations for people, like in the meantime. When you jumped into the wellness inventory, the electronic version,
Mm-hmm.
so you could have that as a break for them to know what it is about.
Yeah.
So feel free to use it if you like the questions or tweak it as you like. And I already see some of you started coloring, so when you have answered your questions, you can draw your wheel on the scale. So in the center is 0, on the edge of the circle is number 4. So you transfer your scores into a chart, so you can nicely see them one next to another. You can see your shape of your wellness wheel. Would you maybe say something about the shapes of the wheel?
Mm-hmm. Who needs more time? Put up your hand. Okay, we'll get a sense. Do you know the history of this theater when it was built?
I don't know it personally. I would guess around like 40s, 50s. It could definitely be written somewhere. So I could look it up if you wanted to know.
It looks a lot more modern than I expected it. Like communists build it.
I think it could have been at the beginning when they were repairing the city after the war, around that time, so the 50s. And it was really run down in the past years, and basically the city, the town hall wanted to close it and turn it into a mall. But the university offered to take care of it, so they bought it for £1. And they have it as the university project now.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
It has the functionalistic shapes and the details with the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
It's really nice.
What was that?
Until now he thought he was balanced.
Oh.
Okay, do you want to say about the wheel?
Yeah. So notice whether if your wheel was rolling down the hill, whether it would roll smoothly, or if it would go ka-thump, ka-thump, and maybe stop halfway around. And assessing a whole area with one question is pretty a pretty big leap. So don't feel too bad if you didn't do well on one question. You might have done better on other questions in that section, but just give you a sense. Does anyone want to share what you got out of it? You get extra points for that. No takers? Don't be shy. Well, I'll open it to general questions at this point, unless you have something specific about this. What did you get out of this? Was it what you expected? Do you have different ideas? And if you're not sure you can express it in English, Jana can interpret for me. Yes. That's next, after the questions. I think we'll have enough time to do that, or it'll be optional if people want to stay for that. I'll let you go if it doesn't interest you. But that's about another 20 minutes. But we have time for that. Are there any other questions, though, with the general topic of wellness? And do you have a bigger picture of wellness, I hope?
I had you mentioned connection and social bonds as some basic currency of wellness. And I've recently come across this idea that there is also quality alone time. Because people actually, because these days people spend a lot of time alone, but not actually alone, like constant distraction, constantly watching TV or reading something, and they're just lying in the grass actually thinking, So I recently read this whole article about it, and I found it really fascinating how important actually quality alone time can be, because when we are together with some people, even if we are not close to them, our social personas take over, and we can lose sense of self, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have some focus on that, or some knowledge for that, some opinion point?
Pretty much what you said. The phenomenon of everybody being on their phone now. I don't know if you're familiar with the School of Life. It's a free series of about 1,000 short videos online. Oh, forget the mic. And the latest one I saw yesterday was on how your phone is destroying your life and how habit forming it is. It distracts you from being in the present of interacting with people. And yet it's so addictive. It's like sugar. It's like, it keeps us from recognizing our own thoughts that you really have to be alone to do. So it's a chronic, the whole speeded up culture that there's so much stimulus going on that people aren't aware of who they really are. And I highly recommend the School of Life if you have any interest. They've got nearly 1,000 videos. There are 2 or 3 new ones a week. I watch as many as I can. I'm actually putting a curriculum together for the other project based on relationships. A lot of their stuff is on relationships. The founder of it, Alain de Botton, had an article in the New York Times called "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person" that went viral. And his book on a couple, a fictional couple, as they grow up, meet each other, and have children, and have this typical life. It's very good stuff. I can't say enough for it. He also did a TED Talk. So, good point. Thank you. Who else would like to comment, question, or whatever? We got a mic for you too.
Can I?
Yeah.
So, what do you think many of us has gadgets, smartwatches, and fitness belts, and so do you think it's only one aspect of your theory, the moving? Could it help, or on one side, or could it stress the people that you have to fill some limits, you have to follow some recommendations? So, is it positive or negative thing from your aspect?
Both. Gadgets and tools like Fitbits, and people that get their 5,000 or 10,000 steps a day, and that. But then that can be a tyranny as well. You can be doing it out of stress, like the runner you saw that's very grim looking. He's got to get out there and put in his time, and he's not enjoying it. So it's really a question of the attitude of, are you enjoying your life? And are you, taking responsibility and experiencing self-love? That's the first one of the energy outputs, and it's the hardest one, I think. So, thanks. We have another question? Over here, yeah. We got another mic. Where is the alternate? Oh, I'll just bring this one over. Yeah.
So my question is slightly different topic, and it concerns the itinerary or the test. How to do it, not to lie to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, when I first developed this, back in 1974, I passed out a bunch of them to our staff in the Health Services Research Department in Baltimore, and the chairman in charge of nursing, the head nurse, she gave me one that was like 100% perfect, and I knew this couldn't be true. I've noticed that I often get a lower score when I take it than a lot of students do. It's really not about what your score is, but what you learn from it. And even if you're padding your answers and lying, your inner self knows what's really true, and that's my goal, is just to educate. So if you want to pad your numbers and get a higher score, fine, it doesn't mean anything. But if you learn something, that's the most important. And we're all lying to ourselves all the time. It's part of the culture. Any other questions? Where is the other mic, by the way? Can we get, oh. You got it, good. All right. Right behind you.
I have a question about sports athletes, like the top of them. I'm sure that probably most of them are not enjoying their sports treatment or something, like they really put up to their maximum. But eventually, their
delayed gratification. Yeah. Well, as a young white male, oldest child in a family of a father who was a driven workaholic, it's taken me 65 years to reduce my workaholism. And how I combated that was with depression. Much of my life I battled depression. When I was 65, I reinvented myself and made a lot of changes. But I hope people start younger and realize that workaholism and striving and the competitive nature that our culture constantly puts before us isn't healthy, and to find ways to balance your life. I see another hand go up. No, someone's scratching their head back there. There was. Oh, we got a woman asking.
I don't want to be greedy, but I have three small big questions. And if you just go back to your kind of 70s, like you initiate this project, was it somehow related to some hippie spirit or trend or cultural movement in the United States? And this is my first question. And second question is about how this inventory works across the different life course, like children to kind of old adults, something like that. And maybe my last question would be how this research and long-term research connected to happiness and the positive psychology research as well.
Good questions. Firstly, yes, I was in medical school when the hippie movement happened. I missed it. I went to San Francisco right after the Summer of Love and just before Woodstock happened. And the whole culture in the early 70s was definitely influenced by the hippies. And you could see from my center, that room that I sandblasted and made it all natural, a lawyer bought the building and painted everything white and tore out my loft after we left. So it was a phase. That was the 70s. Your second question was age groups, yeah. We had a woman do a children's version of it, and she was supposed to send me a copy when she finished it, and I didn't see it. The version I did is white, middle class, educated, it's my own bias. I'd love to see other versions of it done. I think a few have been done, but I'm not aware of them. And lastly, I think the positive psychology movement, or the happiness as it's often called, that Marty Seligman started. In fact, Bobby, the woman who died a wellness death, was in his first coaching program 20 years ago, and I learned about it then. It's much more aligned with what Dunn's approach to wellness was than anything that passes for wellness in the States now. And I often say this, these folks have got it. Dasher Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley has a center. They publish every week. I get a newsletter on happiness, and they've got it. So, yeah, they're not using the word, but they're doing it. So, thank you. Good questions. Next question. And the mic is moving okay.
I'm wondering about your opinion. How long have you been here in Czech?
Last night.
Okay. I'm just wondering about your opinion, maybe not Czech Republic to US, or so maybe US to Europe. How's the biggest difference between the healthy lifestyle or just being healthy in Europe and United States? There are some differences. Do you see something like that, or what's the biggest difference between?
Well, my previous travels in Europe were in 1965 and 1970, so pretty out of date. And I've just spent 2 weeks in England, and I can tell you they're homicidal drivers. Way too many cars going way too fast. Other lifestyle things, I I don't really know. I've been quizzing Jana on a variety of things, like what's the divorce rate and how are kids raised in hospital births. And my personal interest in infant wellness, which is where I moved in the early 90s. I've been focusing mainly on infant wellness because I think that determines our state of health through our whole life. Actually, the 9 months in utero have more influence on your later life choices than any other time in your life. But I don't pretend to have any clue as to the fine points of, in general, Europe is, it's all getting homogenized thanks to media and everything else, but I'm sure there are differences I don't know about. Does someone have a comment? Yeah, please.
Maybe you have heard my name already several times. So to say the whole name, my name is Jana Stara, and I am a doctoral student at the Faculty of Sports Studies at the Masaryk University. And I did a research where I used the JEC's concept and I developed a wellness program. And I did it with students at our university, at our faculty, and then I did it with the students in the States. So to answer your question, what are the differences between the lifestyles? What I noticed with my students is that they were very similar in understandings of what health is and what wellness is. What was the biggest difference for me in terms of lifestyle was that it is much, much more easier to live an unhealthy lifestyle in the States. Because the students, in the example of students, both of the universities have canteens, and we can always go to the canteen. Here, canteen is like a place where we go to have some food. It will be a decent food. It will not be a perfect food, but it will be the cheap option for the student to go and get some nutrition. For my students in the States, it was the fast food place. That's where they went because it was much cheaper. The canteens were super healthy, super nutritious, very well designed, very well built, but they were still more expensive than McDonald's or the other 25 other fast food providers. So it is really much easier to sit with your friends in a McDonald's than it is here. With your friends here you would go to a park, but in the neighborhood where I lived, we didn't have any park. We didn't even have the sidewalks. So really fast foods for many people are the social places where they go to do some, networking or socializing. So this was my observations for that.
Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question? Any more questions? There we go. Pass the mic.
May I ask you if this approach, how this approach is implemented in clinical practice, like taking care about ill people with real illness?
Mm-hmm. That's okay. What I had to deal with in the 70s was people, because I was a doctor and they knew that, they'd expect me to pull a magic pill out and fix them. And we had them sign a contract that we didn't treat, diagnose, or prescribe, and they needed to see their doctor to deal with any illness issues. And in fact, most of the people that we saw had some kind of problem. They weren't motivated to do anything unless they were in pain, whether it was losing a job, a death, or getting fired, whatever. And many had chronic illnesses. I tried, and early on, doctors would want to be doing wellness too, but it's really hard because of the parent-child relationship that you have with the doctor in the pill fairy. So I had envisioned wellness centers next door to a clinic so that people could do both at the same time. I haven't seen that happen very much. And then we have the alternative medicine, now integrative medicine, where the doctors are doing less destructive interventions, but it's still a parent-child fixing relationship. I don't see, I've never actually seen another center function like ours did. There may be. I don't think we've begun to do what Hal Dunn envisioned. And I'm not, I know that through the wellness inventory, the man who trains people in using it, how I met Jana through Jim Strohecker, that they've gotten into nursing programs in some colleges and universities. The Army is investigating using it for sexual harassment problems. And it's getting out into the mainstream in ways that I never thought it would. But in terms of wellness centers functioning like ours, I don't know of any. We've got a long way to go. Another hand. Was that a hand? Nope. Any more? There, we got one back there. Pass that mic. What time is it?
I have a question about this graph that I usually hear that this wellness and stuff is about the balance and about like developing some areas in our life that are not as well or as good as it should be. But what if our situation is that, for example, we are not able to fully develop all our areas? Like we have some responsibilities, so for example, we need to stay in job that we hate, or we have some like disability that limits our sport capacity, movement, and so. Is there a possibility to compensate this stuff in this whole picture, like to be okay, to go for this wellness point, but still not fulfill all the areas?
Well, you saw the woman in the wheelchair there. It's not about perfection. It's not about, when we start shooting on ourselves, that's not wellness. We do the best with what we've got and the situation we're in. So as a semi-reformed perfectionist myself, with a number of perfectionists around me, it's a struggle to not push ourselves into trying to be more and better and whatever. But that isn't wellness.
Thank you very much.
So there's the priority. How much is the new law you have to sing before you start doing something about it? You may feel pretty good about yourself, but it can be better, sure.
Yeah.
And then it starts, because of other priorities, you start seeing this dropping. What is the, like...
How do we get there?
Yeah, what is the point? Start working on yourself in this particular.
I don't have any answer to that. Each person will have to decide for themselves.
Okay, is there any tool to make your priorities?
Well, the computerized wellness inventory, that's the purpose. You answer the question and then you indicate how important it is to you. So if you're going through 120 questions and you sort them that way, it'll show you at the end where your priorities are, which you probably already knew, but it helps to get some quantitative collection of data. So I wish I could give you more of an answer, but I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe I try to continue. Or try to extend this question. You have 12 factors structure. Do you recommend when we would like to increase? Do you recommend to increase all 12 factors, for example, minimum level, or do you prefer to focus on one factor and increase it totally?
Good question. Certainly not trying to do 12. Pick 1 or 2 or 3 maybe. And as you get some success in that, you may want to move on to something else. You may want to up the ante. It's really highly variable. But there's a concept called small changes. It's actually a Japanese word for it that Bobby used to use. Kaizen, yeah. Of small changes, doing small changes, not trying to change the world. The screen has gone black again. Maybe that's a symbol that we should move on, but I'll take a couple more questions. And there we go. Are there more questions? The lighting is such I have trouble seeing hands going up from this level, so. Going once, going twice. I hear a voice. Oh, you got a mic, okay.
How can I help to someone who I know and I see he's like going down, slowly going deep, and he's doing something wrong? Maybe I don't have the key to help him.
Important.
No, but at least tell him like, hey man, stop it, you're going down. At least you should do something with it.
A very important question.
Awareness, like,
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. There's a concept in transactional analysis that Eric Berne developed of it's called the Cartman triangle of persecutor, victim, and rescuer. And if we had time, I could go into the rescuer phenomenon. Basically, it's doing something for someone they have to do themselves. And I was trained as a professional rescuer. I went to rescuing school, got a master's in domination degree or medical deity, whatever you want to call it. And it's hard to see someone when, and we're much better at seeing it in other people than ourselves. But there's no easy answer. Like, there's a concept called the Inarguable Truth, which is what I feel and what I want. And most of the time, I skip that and I go to what you should do to make me happy, to make it better. But if I stick with what I'm feeling, like I'm feeling sad watching you, whatever he or she's doing, and what I want is for you to be happy or whatever. If you stick to those two things, and in your genuine interaction with a person, keep it on your side of the net, that's the most you can do. And it's often a great gift to people because you don't hear that very often. And instead you hear what you should do. And having just come from England, which I think is the culture that's the most specialized in telling people what to do. And that's part of my culture too. I think they invaded all but 22 countries on the whole planet. I saw a map the other day of English conquest. Anyway, apologies to any Englishmen here. Rescuing and telling people what to do is a natural inclination of mine, but it doesn't help much. So, sticking with the inarguable truth. Yeah?
I would just like to chip in on this topic because I think that's a very good question. I would just like to chip in on this because I think that's a very important concept. But basically, you said you can't help people who aren't willing to help themselves. My friend's boyfriend, he's like 15 years drunk and heroin junkie, and so many people around him tried to help him, and he just drained them, and he's still where he was 15 years ago. Zero change, niche, except all those people around him who got dragged in by trying to save him and drag him out without his actual. Maybe one concept I think is important that should be mentioned is not judging those people. If you want to help someone, don't judge them. No further filings because that closes the door immediately. I think that's important to mention, so that's why I just
Yeah.
it's okay.
Thank you. Yeah, good points. Any more questions? Well, what I've got as a encore, if you want to stick around, and also if you want to leave, I won't feel upset. But what I prepared, and I think we have time. What is it?
We have like
20 minutes. Is my interest in infant wellness led to my having another child. I had a child when I was in my residency. I wasn't ready to be a father. I knew I wasn't ready to be a father, and yet it was that or divorce. And in my family in the 1970s, divorce wasn't an option. So I reluctantly, to save the marriage, had a child, and it was a disaster. And we lasted 2.5 years. We got into therapy. We both became trained transactional analysis therapists, but we found we just couldn't live with each other. And so we split up right before I started the Wellness Center. This was all going on in the background. And my now ex-wife stayed in Baltimore, and I moved to California, so we were 3,000 miles apart with a 3-year-old daughter. It was very painful. It was the hardest decision in my life. And that stayed with me, and I met and married an Australian 4 or 5 years later. We planned never to have kids. We eventually did, though 12 years later her biological alarm went off. We were involved in attachment parenting and the Continuum concept, and we thought, well, this will be different. And we were living on 40 acres in the middle of nowhere with another couple who had a young child, had a home birth, a water birth with a midwife, all the things that hadn't happened the first time around. It was still a struggle. And and we actually planned to split up when my second daughter, who was 21 years younger, was 3 or 4, but we stayed together. I eventually figured out a pattern that I've named male postpartum abandonment syndrome, MPAS, which is the dynamic of what I think happens when children are born into a nuclear family. And I have about a 15-minute presentation on that subject, which I will offer you now and give you a break if you want to. What's this? Trying to connect me to the internet. So leave now or sit quietly. So the question is, why does having children destroy marriages? I'll give you a second to clear out. Thank you all for coming for the wellness part, and the encore is definitely optional. Some humor from a little booklet. So another poll. Before I start talking about this, were you aware that there's an epidemic of disconnection in Western culture? Let's see how many people had that awareness. That's about typical. It's so invisible we can't see it. If you go to a culture, in California we see a lot of Mexican families in restaurants sitting around where the men are playing with the babies. There's this big happy family thing going on. I lived in Costa Rica for 4 years, and I used to ride a bus up to the mountaintop, and I'd be one of the few gringos. It was a big happy family. They were having fun, It was like 30 strangers on a bus, only they probably weren't strangers, but they were having, you wouldn't see that in an American bus ever. And so this disconnected culture that we live in, which is largely Western, Northern European, cold climates, I think, initiated a lot of the disconnection. My premise is that there is this massive disconnection, and a little more humor on the topic of these cartoons is pretty much the dysfunction, that the humor is based on the dysfunction in the war between the sexes and children. So in the US, about 30% of fathers leave shortly after the birth of their child, and probably 90% plus leave emotionally, if not physically. And I had to extrapolate this data from a database. No one's ever actually measured it directly, but I was able to extrapolate it. And it's interesting to me that no one has studied this. Why? I think it's too threatening. My efforts to publicize this in the last, I've been doing this work for 10 or 15 years. Basically, the media have a dome of silence. They don't want to talk about it, and people don't want to recognize it. It's hard to talk about. It's too painful. So as I said earlier, I live in this laboratory, Australia being similar. And this is a review again, too. So the symptom of what I call the epidemic of disappearing dads, I've now realized it's not necessarily the dad disappears relative to the mother and child. Often they stay in the house and the father doesn't. So it looks like he disappears, but it's really the relationship that's disappeared. It's the primary relationship, and that's our focus now. We just got funding for a major project to do this work, and a website that's just getting launched. I'll show you sections of it later. So I call it male postpartum abandonment syndrome. The hypothesis, or MPAS is how you pronounce the abbreviation. So I'll let you read this hypothesis. There's 6 different steps. I'm glad that circumcision isn't as rampant here, isn't it, like it is in the States. That's one variable that you don't have. And I understand that that breastfeeding is a lot more common here than it is in the States. So the boy grows up looking for the mommy he never had, finds her, marries her, thinks it's all okay, and then bingo, has a baby. And the mother-baby unit, and they are a unit, they really are inseparable and should be inseparable. But we were never meant to raise children in a nuclear family. So what happens is that the father's early wounding gets re-stimulated and he begins to decompensate, self-medicate, and either leaves emotionally and or physically. And it's so subtle that we don't even notice it. It also happens gradually. The man's excitement with the new baby is pretty overpowering, and as that fades, then things begin to fall apart. When I spoke to Warren Farrell, he's a leader in the men's movement, he summarized it this way, that to support his wife and her new lover, and that's how it feels emotionally. He can't say that, probably doesn't even recognize it, but that's what's going on his little child. So a graphic summary of the process. So I think it takes 3.87 adults per child to adequately meet the needs. So you can do the math of a nuclear family. We've destroyed the primary human family structure, extended family structure. Though it's not as bad here as in the States, I understand people don't move to the other side of the country at the drop of a hat because their company relocated them. But we do have this nuclear family disaster. But it's important to remember, again, that it's not an individual's fault, it's the culture and the untenable situation that we're forced to deal with. So there are many stages of connection. They begin with the mother and father, actually with the mother in utero, and then expand through the family, the tribe, the village, the earth itself, and self-connection when you become more aware of yourself and whatever your sense of the divine is. So each level depends on the stability of the previous level. I got this from my mentor, Joseph Chilton Pearce, who wrote Crack in the Cosmic Egg and The Magical Child, a real hero of mine. So different ways that we disconnect. We're afraid, in the States anyway, that we're going to spoil a child if we meet their basic mammalian needs. But babies were meant to be carried and not touch the ground in some cultures until they're 9 months old. That constant movement that you experience in utero, if you're taken out of that and put in to lie alone in a crib, it's hell for a baby. And they'll cry about it up to a certain point, but if we ignore it, then they give up. So fortunately, number 2 isn't true here. These are some of the ways that we disconnect kids. And we've tried to replace the missing village with all these authoritarian institutions. Now, what's practiced in the States primarily is coercion parenting as contrasted to connection parenting, which I'll get to later. We had a TV show called The Super Nanny where she would come in and lay down some harsh consequences and try to undo damage. But the important thing is to recognize that so-called bad behavior isn't the problem. It's a key, it's a cry for an unmet need, and finding the key to that is important. So decoding the behavior and seeing what the unmet need is. Try to keep it light here. So a man named James Prescott at NIH, who enlightened me back in '96 when I met him, came up with this concept of somatosensory affectional deprivation syndrome. And he said there were 3 results: addiction, depression, and violence. And you may have noticed I used these in the earlier presentation. I added to it chronic illness, materialism, and greed, the one we're going to talk about now, along with fundamentalism and ecocide. And I'm going to go through them in more detail. Addictions can be to any number of things. I need to add phones on here. Just realized. Workaholism is one of my methods. And then we have depression, as I mentioned earlier. That was a major issue for me. In my family, only my mother was allowed to express feelings, so I learned to withdraw and get depressed. Took a long time to unlearn that one. Then we have violence and aggression, physical, emotional, guilting, the gift that keeps on giving, and shaming, which is a more core thing in the limbic system of our brain. All the different forms of emotional violence, shaming and sarcasm. The ultimate violence is suicide. And these chronic illnesses, I'll back up. Heart disease and cancer, and now we're seeing all kinds of other dementia is a major problem in the States. The vagaries of English. So how they manifest is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And the one we're going to focus on the most here, the high percentage of men, fathers leaving, and the larger number that leave emotionally. And fundamentalism. And lastly, ecocide. This is the one that's really getting the attention now, with harder and harder to deny global warming, especially if you live in Florida. And moving along to, well, what's the cure? And I'm going to skip a section where I go through my own process of discovering my impasse, because we don't have time for that, but there's a whole book about it that I'll mention. So while we can't necessarily cure it, we can at least compensate for it and learn to not be run by it. And it's important to do your personal work and to remember that Ben Franklin's numbers were off a little bit. An ounce of prevention is worth a whole lot more of cure. And all the money goes into cure, very little on prevention. So the first step is to be aware of your own disconnection, something I wasn't for a long time. And this is when I do that section, I'm going to skip that. So it's the relationship. It's independent of the father's ability or interest in fathering. People confuse that. Often when a couple are distant, they're still both very good parents. It's just their relationship, which models relationship for the child as well. So reviewing, there may not be a cure, but forewarned is forearmed. So important to do your personal work, ideally before you have kids, and if you're thinking about having kids. And my hope is that we'll raise babies that don't have to recover from their childhood at some point in the future. So that our wounds of disconnection, my wound of disconnection has led to my creating a number of communities, a recent one where we've just moved in California, and another plug for Ben Franklin's comment. There is a self-assessment that you can get on the website. I won't spend time on this, but it's a quickie just to see what your level of impasse is. And now moving on to preventing it and connection parenting. As I mentioned, there's a new website, a new project that we just got funded, and it was Father's Day of this year. This slide's left over from, I gave this talk right after Father's Day in Wisconsin. Our website, there are two different addresses there, the long one or the short one, cc-tf.org, and I'm going to show you some pieces of it. And the mission is to reach 10,000 family support professionals about healing the epidemic of disconnection in the next 3 years. So you've seen this already. And we've modified the illness-wellness continuum into one that reflects the situation in a relationship. Pain on the left side, hopeless disconnection, with thriving connection on the right side, and all the stages in between. So a lot of it has to do with the individualism that is so highly touted in American culture anyway, versus a partnership paradigm and the steps along the way. So the first step is to name and analyze the crisis in order to do something about it. And we're posting video interviews with men and women who have experienced impasse and how they've dealt with it. Our website is still in a late beta stage, but it's a great resource of what we can do about this. So see it, name it, understand it, and we can do something about it. We have a section on the actual pathology, and the book that my now ex-wife and I wrote. We were just about to publish this when we split up. 18 years it took, but our relationship had deteriorated, and we were in the middle of it. But life imitated art, I do believe the nuclear family experiment has been a disaster, and that we need to create alternatives to that, because one or two people don't make up a village. So we have a whole section on what you can do to expand your family, find other supportive people. So many people go into marriage unprepared for what having children will lead to. And we have a lot of resources on the website, including the book. These are some of the ways that you build community. So it's a choice. Will it be on the left or on the right? So connection parenting is a term that one of our board members, we formed this alliance, a nonprofit, back in 1999 and have done a number of things. I'm going to skip over this section real quickly. It's the key components of connection parenting, because we're running out of time, but there are a lot of pieces to it. Just give you a gestalt view of it. We had one more there. And this cover of the New Yorker back in, well, 11 years ago says it all. Notice who's looking at who. The father's looking at the mother's looking at the baby, and the baby's looking at the animals. And the crib with the barbed wire around it is very telling. And this is the status, I think, of how many children are raised. It's how I was raised. And my father did stick around, but he was a busy practitioner and I hardly saw him. So what's missing in connection parenting are all the devices and nurseries, being left to cry, artificial baby food. Kids are often warehoused in daycare centers at age 3 months. I'm delighted to learn you have a 3-year maternity leave. That's wonderful. Lucky to get 3 months in the States. The average age for weaning of human beings that they worked out before we started messing with it with our industrialization was between 4 and 7. The World Health Organization recommends at least 2 years, and the American Academy of Pediatrics went from 6 months to a year about 5 years ago. So they're halfway there to a bare minimum. So these are the things that you don't do if you're connected with your child. A fascinating book called Punished by Rewards by a PhD at the University of Chicago. And there's a lot of that going on that leave a lot of spoiled, entitled kids who have been punished through a reward system. We can skip this one because I gather they're not missing here. What our alliance did was form a proclamation and blueprint. We put 10,000 hours into developing the missing instruction manual, which we summarized in 15 steps. All these are downloadable on our website, the atlc.org website. And to summarize, And those of you who are parents might be able to relate to this. And in conclusion, what can we do? And I understand that most births here are in hospital also, but that water births are coming in birthing centers. Most Americans are terrified of birth because of how the media has portrayed it. In so-called primitive cultures, women will drop a baby in a field and put them in their arms and go back to work. No big deal. You know, it's not that hard. But you lay a woman on her back in a strange situation with bright lights and strangers running around, and it's any wonder she has trouble pushing a baby against gravity, which is silly to begin with, and with a bunch of strangers. It's just, hospitals are important for about 5 to 10% of the high-risk births, but it produces the cascade of interventions that are done to speed birth up and so-called make it easier, create most of the problems. So it's not normal. And yet the fear drives women into hospitals. So I'll summarize with this quote of Hillary's. It's for all of us. They're our future. And that's it. I didn't mention that earlier picture of the girl in the fountain was this same daughter 24 years ago. This one was about 20 years ago. So if there are any questions on this, I'll take them. Otherwise, let's see, we are coming up on 5:20, so we have 10 minutes if we need it, or if not, we can break early. And I hope that gave you an idea of what my passion is now and the importance of infant wellness and relationship wellness. So, questions or comments? Yeah. You get the record for questions today.
I'm inquisitive person.
Good, good.
Briefly, you mentioned education system as one of contributors to the, dysfunctional, as one of factors that participate in creating dysfunctional adults. And in last year or so, I had the great opportunity to work with kids, and I noticed that too. Actually, relating to school system, one of words that comes to my mind is gulag. But I was curious about your, maybe if you could develop that point, because you just mentioned school system and it was it, and I think that maybe it deserves deeper, I don't know, to explore the topic. Could you maybe develop that point?
I'm missing a couple words there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, you mentioned schools.
Schools, I did? Oh, okay.
So if you could develop that point, if you could maybe talk about particulars of it, what's your view on it?
Of disconnected adults or of schools?
Well, you mentioned how schools, the way school system is, contributes
Oh, okay, yeah.
to that phenomenon.
Now I'm with you.
I'm sorry if I wasn't clear in time.
Yeah. We homeschooled my second daughter, the one you saw the pictures of, and she could do all the schoolwork in an hour or two. Putting a group of kids together in the same age group is very abnormal. In fact, when she did go to school in the 6th grade, she was in a one-room school with all 6 years. And the older ones were helping the younger ones. And they used to have one-room schools in the States, up in the country where I lived. But what happens is you get this herd of the same cohort of the same age, and it's very unnatural. You're missing a whole range of experience, and from kids of different ages to grandparents dying to babies being born to the human experience that you get in a village. And schools are like warehouses and training programs to get nice compliant workers to fulfill the corporate mission of money and or the army, cannon fodder for the boys. So it's unfortunate in this culture that there's probably not a viable alternative, but there's a lot of cost to that compartmentalizing in a same age group. And then the peer pressure that happens, particularly with teenage girls and how they gang up. And, you know, I could go on, but it's an artifact of destroying the village. And it leads to competitiveness and all kinds of not good things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less. I think my own observation about it is that basically you are teaching people how to sit straight for 2 hours and be bored out of their minds.
Yeah.
Why don't you want to do that?
Exactly. Yeah. When we were homeschooling my daughter, she'd go out and jump on the trampoline in between a lesson, and you know they need movement. There's actually a whole book about that. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but we label these kids that are trying to move as hyperactive when it's natural. You know, they just haven't been beaten down as quickly as the other kids. There's 8 different kinds of intelligence. Originally it was 7, the 7 kinds of smarts, and 2 of them are mathematical and verbal, but there's 5 or 6 others, and they aren't addressed in school. So it's a sad situation. Any other questions? Yeah, that's what I tried to do there at the end, but it went by pretty fast. If you first recognize your own disconnection and what you're looking for in a relationship, it's the primary relationship, the mother and father, and we go into it largely unsuspecting of how disruptive having a child's going to be. And so building a stronger connection, being aware of the challenges, recognizing your own wounding, and you can't avoid being wounded in the culture we live in, or probably any culture. So the personal work is crucial. Having support, so you're not just 2 people trying to do the work of 3.87 people. And even that, and with my second daughter, we did have my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law, so we had 4 people. But we didn't have a village. And that whole interaction of different age groups, it's, crucial. So being aware of the challenges and getting the resources. So the website has a lot more resources. That's the best I can tell you right now. It's a big one. I think we'll have time for one more question and then wrap it up. If there is one more question. All right, well, that projector is blinding me, so if there's a hand up, I can't see it. But thank you all for coming. I hope you've got a better understanding of wellness and maybe of relationship wellness and infant wellness as well. So, my best to you.